Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little, and I am proud to bring you my newest webinar where I'm going to be going over 30 hands that I played at live 1-2 no limit. So when I was recently at the Borgata for the $15,000 buy-in World Poker Tour Championship, I decided to spend as much time as I reasonably could playing $1, $2 cash games. And the reason I did this is because a lot of people said that, you make content on high stakes cash games, but that's not applicable to our games. And I completely disagree with that comment. However, I wanted to actually test it myself because I recognize that I do not play 1-2 no limit, so I wanted to get in there and try it. So I did play for 15 hours, and over those 15 hours, I won $650, which is a pretty good hourly rate. I probably ran a little bit hotter than normal. I did end up winning with the nut flush draw one time when I got it all in versus a set. So that was fortunate. If I did not win that hand, I would have been up, I guess, probably around $300. So even then, still $20 per hour win rate is certainly acceptable. So yeah, I definitely learned a lot about my opponents, and I took diligent notes throughout the entire process. And I will be reviewing and sharing with you a lot of the mental flaws that a lot of the opponents had that I found to be pretty easily exploitable. But as for the hands, I'm going to be going over 30 of those, and today I wanted to share one of those with you. And I wanted to keep this sort of as raw as possible to let you guys know how I actually take notes at the poker table. So the first line here is the hand. I had Jack-8 of diamonds. The stack is $240, and then my position is the hijack. The positions are the big blind and the small blind, and then the button. Everyone knows those. The person to the right of the button is the cutoff. The person to the right of the cutoff is the hijack. So I guess 2 off the button. So in this hand, I raised to $7, which means everyone folded around to me. By the way, there was a lot of limping in these games, so I will be discussing extensively how to deal with the limpers. The small blind and the big blind both called. These were both somewhat loose-ish, passive-ish players, and I thought they could have pretty wide ranges. So the flop comes 10-9-3, giving me an open-ended straight draw, which is fantastic. This is usually, I'm not going to say it's better than an open-ended straight draw, because if the queen comes, it's not to the nuts, because someone could have king-jack, but it is a little bit more concealed, and that if a 7 comes, a lot of people aren't going to put you on Jack-8. So that's worth noting. Whereas if, say, the board comes with an 8 on the turn, people are going to generally just assume you have queen-jack because it's much easier to see. But I think that's, well, so in the high-stakes games, that's a completely irrelevant thought process. But in the lower-stakes games, I do think that that is at least marginally relevant. So anyways, small blind leads into me for $7. Big blind folds. And now I have to decide if I want to call or raise. And I actually saw these leads quite often. And a lot of these people think that when they're betting 7, they're showing strength. They think, I'm going to bet and see what my opponent does, and then I'm going to evaluate. Other players, though, they will lead in the spot and then never fold if you raise on the flop, assuming that you must be trying to push them off of their hand. So I wasn't really sure about this specific opponent in this hand. So my general plan was to call the flop, and then if my opponent checked the turn, I was probably going to bet the turn and then bet the river, whether or not I hit. And if my opponent bet large on the turn, I'd probably just continue calling. But then my opponent kind of surprised me, and he bet small again. And this was another line that I saw very often in these games that I almost never see in the high-stakes games. So it's good that I do get to explore these with you guys. And so the turn was a 4, which is a complete blank, and he bets $7. So now he's betting, well, first off, he bet a 3rd pot on the flop. Now he's betting something like a 6th pot on the turn. I guess it's a 5th pot on the turn. So I perceive this to be a relatively marginal made hand that he is trying to get to the showdown cheaply with. So if that's the case, he probably has something like a 10 or a 9. So I don't know if I can blow him off of a 10 by raising, but I probably can make him fold a 9. So I decided to raise to 36, which was a little bit less than a pot size raise, but it's certainly significant compared to a small bet. You're going to find that when guys are betting something like 7, if you raise to 36, that's going to feel significant to him. You don't need to make it 54 or whatever a pot size raise is. I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but you don't need to make it humongous because people will fold to these $36 raises. If I was raising in this spot for value, I would probably be making it even smaller, probably around something like 23 or 22, maybe even something like 19. But I guess I should make it clear, if I had a value hand, like say I had pocket threes on this board or pocket aces, I probably would have just raised the flop to something like 20 and then bet the turn 34 and then bet the river 58 or something like that. I think that's going to be a line that's going to induce much more value. And I think this line is going to be a line that's going to induce many more folds. So I definitely made a point to play really exploitably in this cash game, meaning I'm really trying to get out of line and take advantage of my opponents. And it worked pretty well. There were quite a few spots where I could make my opponents fold or induce them to call on the river by perhaps betting somewhat small, giving them good odds to call with stuff like middle pair. But we'll go through all those hands in the webinar. Anyways, my opponent did fold, and he didn't show us the cards, of course, but I'm fairly confident he had a 9 or maybe even a 3 in this hand. And if he did have a 10, I think he'd probably call the 36 raise, and then on the river, he'd probably check fold to a bet of something like 68. So that was my general plan in this hand, and you have to realize that this line where your opponent bets into you, while that is somewhat, he thinks that's strong, and he thinks I'm saying, look, I have a good hand, what are you going to do about it? He's actually saying, I have something marginal, please steal this pot from me. So I did attack that, and we won that pot, no problem. So as for the webinar, I will be reviewing 30 hands that I played over the 15 hours. I was considering reviewing all of the hands, but after I started writing down all of the hands for like an hour, it was clearly a lot. So I decided to go through and pick out 30 hands, which is still quite a bit of the hands, that I think are educational. I didn't want to just show you hands where I raised with ace king and one guy called and the flop came 9-7-4 and I continuation bet and he folded. That's fairly standard stuff. I wanted to try to show you hands that you guys can take lessons away from, and I will be discussing the lessons that you can take from these hands. I'm also going to discuss numerous things that I saw these players do incorrectly. And off the top of my head, one of the things that I saw them doing on a very regular basis was making it very clear that they wanted to put their stack in when they actually had a good hand. So I guess I'll give you one more hand very briefly. There was a spot where there was a bunch of limpers, 3 or 4 or 5 limpers. I limped with ace 5 suited on the button. Small blind raised small to 7, and then everyone called. Flop came ace, king, queen. So it checks around to the guy at the cutoff, and as soon as they checked him, he just instantly shoves his 40 big blind stack, or $40 stack into the roughly $40 pot. Like just instantly jammed it in. And I was going to fold this hand pretty easily, but I looked to the left and saw the guy in the small blind, who was the pre-flop raiser, just like getting ready to jam his stack in as well. And so I was sitting here thinking, like, if I had something like ace queen, am I supposed to fold this? As ridiculous as that sounds, ace queen on ace king queen. I think I was probably supposed to fold ace queen. Ace king in that spot, I would have been sick about it. And I mean, maybe even that's a fold. And I know that sounds really tight, but you have to realize if 2 guys are happily jamming their stack in, you need to be really snug when it comes to getting your stack in. So that came up on a very regular basis where guys were making it clear when they wanted to put their stack in. And in that hand, both guys had the nuts straight. They both flopped jack 10. So I probably would have ended up not folding something like pocket queens if I had pocket queens somehow, which I never do in that limp pot. But I would have been sick about it. So anyways, I'm going to be discussing numerous things that I saw these players do incorrectly that I think are very easily fixable in this exclusive webinar. So the webinar will be on May 13th at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, 6 p.m. Pacific Time. I've had a lot of requests to do a webinar a little bit later so that the people on the West Coast in America can have access to it. And seeing how there are a lot of small stakes cash games on the West Coast, I tried to do this one a little bit later. I realized it's a little bit late for the people on the East Coast and especially in Europe. However, I will be sending out the videos to everyone who does sign up for the webinar. And also, if you do have questions for me and you know you will not be able to attend live, you can email those in, and I would be happy to answer those in the webinar in the question and answer section. At the end of all of my webinars, I always do roughly a 45-minute to an hour question and answer session until everyone has had all their questions answered. And speaking of that, I definitely suggest that you guys attend live and ask me questions as I go through my hands. I want to do everything I can to be as exhaustive as possible so that you guys can really understand the things that I'm doing in the cash games that allow me to do well. And, of course, I didn't only play 15 hours, but winning 650 in 15 hours is a pretty nice win rate. And I really did not feel at any point that I was at risk of losing a lot of hands. I mean, I think I only got it all in one or two times for any significant amount of money. And, both times I was in roughly a flipping scenario. So it's not like I was often getting it in bad or anything like that. I was really just grinding up a lot of small pots, sealing it when it made sense, and getting full value for my hands. And I never really felt much pressure. Like, I know whenever I play 25-50 or bigger, quite often I feel pressure in that people are raising and re-raising and applying a lot of aggression to you. And it does make you risk your stack quite often. Whereas in this game, that never really happened. It also never really happens at stuff like 5-10 no limit. And people are not blindly applying pressure with a wide range, and I think that makes the games very easy to just slowly grind up a stack. So, anyways, I definitely suggest you guys come and ask me all of your questions in the webinar. But if you cannot attend live, I will be sending you the recordings. And just to reiterate, there are situations that come up over and over again in cash games that a lot of the player pool is messing up on a regular basis. And if you can fix those problems, I think you'll be able to easily beat these games, assuming you play reasonably solid poker. And I'm excited to share all these things with you in this webinar. So be sure to sign up at jonathanlittlepoker.com/livecash, all lowercase, jonathanlittlepoker.com/livecash. Can't speak. And I'm excited to see you there. Be sure to come with all of your cash game questions, and I will talk to you then.